You murdered my mother. You murdered my uncle. You're a monster, and I hope you rot in prison." 23-year-old Sarah Hendricks lunged across the courtroom toward her grandmother, 68-year-old Margaret Hendricks, screaming in rage as bailiffs struggled to restrain her during the sentencing hearing on a cold February afternoon in 2018. Margaret had just been sentenced to consecutive life sentences for the murders of her two adult children, 42-year-old Linda Hendricks Morrison and 38-year-old Daniel Hendricks, whom she had poisoned with cyanide during what was supposed to be a routine family dinner at her home in rural Pennsylvania. The attack by Sarah and her brother Michael, who also had to be physically removed from the courtroom after attempting to strike his grandmother, shocked the proceedings and captured the raw grief and rage of a family destroyed by a woman who should have been their matriarch and protector. Throughout the 6-week trial, Margaret had maintained an eerie composure, showing no visible remorse when confronted with evidence of her meticulous planning, her purchase of the poison, and the agonizing deaths of her own children. Her attorneys had argued that she suffered from severe depression and psychotic delusions, that years of caring for her disabled husband had broken her mentally, and that she genuinely believed she was saving her children from suffering she believed was inevitable. But the jury, after hearing overwhelming evidence of premeditation, financial motives tied to life insurance policies, and Margaret's own recorded statements admitting the murders without genuine remorse, had rejected the insanity defense and convicted her of 2 counts of first-degree murder. What made this case particularly haunting was not just that a grandmother had killed her children, but that she had done so in the most intimate setting imaginable at a family dinner table where love and connection should have been shared, transforming a symbol of family unity into a scene of calculated murder. Before we continue with this extraordinarily tragic case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we explore this disturbing case of familicide, the psychology of family annihilators, and how grief and rage manifested in a courtroom attack that shocked everyone present. The small town of Millville, Pennsylvania, population approximately 8,000, sat in the agricultural heartland of Lancaster County, surrounded by farmland, Amish communities, and the kind of rural landscape that represented traditional American values and close-knit family bonds. Millville was a place where generations of families remained rooted, where children grew up, married, and often settled within miles of their parents and grandparents, and where family dinners on Sunday afternoons were sacred traditions that bound extended families together. The local economy centered on agriculture, small manufacturing, and service businesses that catered to both residents and tourists visiting Pennsylvania Dutch country. It was a community where violent crime was virtually non-existent, where doors remained unlocked, and where the idea that a grandmother could murder her children was simply incomprehensible. The Hendricks family had deep roots in Millville, stretching back 4 generations to when Margaret's grandfather had purchased farmland in the area in the early 1900s. The family had transitioned from farming to other occupations over the decades, but they had remained in Millville, maintaining the family homestead and the traditions that came with it. Margaret Hendricks, born Margaret Louise Patterson in 1950, had grown up on that land, had married Robert Hendricks there in 1970, and had raised her two children, Linda and Daniel, in the same house where she would ultimately take their lives nearly 5 decades later. Linda Marie Hendricks Morrison was 42 years old when her mother murdered her on the evening of October 14, 2017. The elder of Margaret's two children, Linda, had grown up in Millville, attended local schools, and had eventually left for college at Penn State University, where she had earned a degree in education. After college, Linda had returned to Lancaster County, settling in the nearby city of Lancaster, where she had built a successful career as an elementary school principal. Her return to the area had been motivated partly by practical considerations, teaching jobs and administrative positions in rural Pennsylvania, but mostly by her deep attachment to family and her desire to remain close to her parents and to the community where she had been raised. Linda's personality was described consistently by colleagues, friends, and family members as warm, dedicated, and possessed of an unusual capacity for patience and understanding. As principal of Riverside Elementary School in Lancaster, a position she had held for 8 years, Linda had been known for creating an environment where teachers felt supported, where students felt safe, and where parents felt their children were valued. Her approach to education emphasized not just academic achievement, but emotional and social development, reflecting her belief that schools should nurture the whole child rather than simply delivering curriculum. Teachers who worked under Linda's leadership described her as someone who led by example rather than by authority, who was willing to handle difficult situations personally rather than delegating unpleasant tasks, and who genuinely celebrated others' successes without needing to claim credit. Parents described her as approachable and responsive, someone who returned calls promptly, who listened without judgment, and who worked collaboratively to address concerns rather than defensively protecting institutional interests. Students, even young elementary-age children, seemed to recognize that Mrs. Morrison cared about them as individuals, with many former students returning years later to tell her about their lives and to thank her for her impact. Beyond her professional accomplishments, Linda had been a devoted mother to her two children, Sarah, 23, and Michael, 21, both of whom had been pursuing their own educational and career goals while maintaining close relationships with their mother. Linda's marriage to Thomas Morrison had ended in divorce 10 years before her death, but the relationship had remained amicable with shared custody and co-parenting that prioritized the children's well-being. Thomas would later describe Linda as the best mother our children could have had, and as someone whose murder left a void that can never be filled. Linda had been particularly close with her mother Margaret, speaking with her multiple times weekly, visiting regularly, and including her mother in her children's lives. Sarah and Michael had grown up seeing their grandmother frequently, celebrating holidays at the family homestead, and maintaining the kind of multi-generational bonds that characterized many families in rural Pennsylvania. The closeness of this relationship, the trust that Linda had placed in her mother, made the circumstances of her death poisoned at her mother's dinner table particularly devastating for those who survived her. In the months before her death, Linda had been dealing with normal middle-age challenges, but had shown no signs of distress that might have predicted the tragedy to come. She had been managing the complexities of her administrative role, supporting Sarah through graduate school applications, encouraging Michael in his final year of college, and navigating the typical concerns of a woman in her early 40s, balancing career and family. Friends who knew her well described her as content with her life, proud of her children, and optimistic about the future. There was nothing in Linda's circumstances or behavior that suggested she was in any danger, particularly not from her own mother. Linda's journal, discovered after her death and submitted as evidence during trial, revealed a woman who has been concerned about her mother's mental state in the months before the murders. An entry from August 2017, 2 months before Linda's death, read, "Mom seems more depressed lately. She's been talking a lot about how hard things have been since Dad's stroke, about feeling overwhelmed by his care needs. I've offered to help more, to arrange for home health services, but she insists she can manage. I worry about her, but I also know Mom has always been independent and doesn't ask for help easily." Another entry from September 2017 showed Linda's growing but still unfocused concern. "Had dinner at Mom's yesterday. She seemed distracted, almost distant. When I asked if she was okay, she said something strange that she was working on a plan to make things easier for everyone. I asked what she meant, but she changed the subject. I've been thinking about that comment all week. It probably means nothing, just Mom being Mom and trying to figure out how to simplify her life. But something about the way she said it felt off." These entries, read aloud during trial, would haunt Linda's children and would raise agonizing questions about whether Linda had sensed danger without consciously recognizing it, whether she could have protected herself if she had trusted her instincts, and whether Margaret's planning had been visible to someone paying close enough attention. The fact that Linda had noted her mother's strange behavior, but had rationalized it rather than acting on her concerns, became a source of profound what-if speculation for those who loved her. Daniel Robert Hendricks was 38 years old when his mother murdered him alongside his sister. 4 years younger than Linda, Daniel had followed a different path, but had remained equally rooted in family and community. After high school, Daniel had attended a technical school for automotive mechanics and had eventually opened his own repair shop in Millville, building a successful business through reputation for honest work and fair prices. Community members described Daniel as someone who would stay late to finish a repair for a customer who needed their car for work the next day, who charged reasonable rates even when he could have charged more, and who treated everyone from wealthy farmers to struggling single mothers with equal respect and consideration. Daniel's personality was characterized by quiet competence rather than flashy charm. He was described as someone who expressed love through action rather than words, who showed up when needed without being asked, and who could be relied upon absolutely when he made a commitment. Friends noted that Daniel had inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's loyalty to family, creating a combination that made him a pillar of both his family and his community. Daniel had never married and had no children, a fact that he occasionally joked about with friends, but that seemed to cause him no distress. He had devoted himself to his business, to caring for his parents as they aged, and to maintaining close relationships with his sister's children, whom he treated almost as his own. Sarah and Michael would later describe their uncle as someone who had attended every school event, who had taught them practical skills from changing oil to managing money, and who had provided steady presence and support throughout their lives. Daniel's role in caring for his father Robert after Robert's stroke in 2015 had been substantial. While Margaret had been the primary caregiver, Daniel had helped with physical tasks that Margaret couldn't manage, had assisted with medical appointments and equipment, and had provided emotional support to both parents during a difficult transition. This dedication to family care, while admirable, had also created challenges for Daniel. His business suffered from his absences. His personal life was constrained by caregiving duties, and his own health and well-being had been somewhat neglected in service of his parents' needs. In the months before his death, Daniel had been dealing with the accumulated stress of years of caregiving, while trying to maintain his business and some semblance of personal life. Friends noted that he seemed tired and worried, particularly about his mother's increasing social withdrawal and what he perceived as her deteriorating mental state. One friend, testifying during trial, recalled a conversation from September 2017 where Daniel had said, "Mom's not herself lately. She's always been strong, always managed everything, but lately she seems defeated. I'm worried about her, but I don't know how to help someone who won't admit they need help." This concern for his mother, this desire to support and help her, made Daniel's murder particularly cruel. He had died trying to care for the person who was planning to kill him, never imagining that his mother's apparent depression and withdrawal were masking something far darker than mere overwhelm. Margaret Louise Hendricks was 68 years old when she murdered her children. Born in Millville in 1950 as the youngest of 3 children to a farming family, Margaret had grown up in an era when women's roles were more constrained, and when dutiful service to family was considered a woman's highest calling. She had been described by those who knew her in earlier decades as competent, organized, and deeply invested in maintaining family traditions and connections. After marrying Robert Hendricks in 1970, Margaret had devoted herself to creating a home, raising children, and supporting her husband's career as a machinist at a local manufacturing plant. For most of her adult life, Margaret had been exactly what small-town Pennsylvania expected of women of her generation: a devoted wife, an attentive mother, an active church member, and a reliable presence in community activities. She had hosted family dinners every Sunday for decades, had maintained the family homestead with pride, and had been the kind of grandmother who baked cookies, attended grandchildren's events, and created the memory-filled childhood that Sarah and Michael would later remember with both nostalgia and horror. However, beneath this conventional exterior, evidence would emerge suggesting that Margaret had struggled for years with mental health issues that had been inadequately recognized and addressed. Medical records that became evidence during trial revealed a history of treatment for depression beginning in her 40s, with multiple hospitalizations for what were described as nervous breakdowns in the 1990s and early 2000s. She had been prescribed various antidepressants over the years, with mixed results and frequent medication changes when side effects became intolerable or effectiveness diminished. Most significantly, Margaret's mental health had deteriorated markedly after her husband Robert, suffered a severe stroke in 2015 that left him partially paralyzed and requiring significant daily care. The burden of caregiving for a severely disabled spouse, combined with the loss of the partnership and companionship that had defined her marriage, appeared to have triggered a psychological crisis that would ultimately culminate in murder. Friends and family members noted that Margaret had become increasingly withdrawn after Robert's stroke, declining social invitations, reducing her church attendance, and seeming to exist primarily in service of Robert's care needs with little attention to her own well-being. Margaret's primary care physician would testify during trial that he had noted signs of worsening depression during appointments in 2016 and 2017, that he had recommended psychiatric consultation and adjustment of her medications, but that Margaret had been resistant to seeking specialized mental health care. She was of a generation that viewed mental illness as something shameful to hide rather than something treatable to address, Dr. Peter Wilson testified. I urged her multiple times to see a psychiatrist, to consider whether her current medications were adequate, but she insisted she could manage with her primary care prescriptions and that she didn't need a head doctor, as she put it. What would emerge during investigation was that Margaret's depression had evolved into something darker and more dangerous in the months before the murders. A journal discovered in her bedroom after her arrest revealed disturbing entries documenting her declining mental state and her developing plan to kill her children. An entry from July 2017, 3 months before the murders, read, "I can't keep doing this. Robert needs constant care and it never ends. The children have their own lives and their own problems. I look at them and I see all the suffering that's coming for them: aging, illness, loss, disappointment. What kind of mother brought them into a world where suffering is inevitable? What kind of mother leaves them to face it alone when I'm gone?" Another entry from August 2017 showed Margaret's thinking becoming increasingly distorted. "I've been researching peaceful ways to die. If I'm going to end this burden for myself, shouldn't I spare them too? They don't know what's coming. Linda is dealing with so much stress at work. Daniel is exhausted from helping with Robert. If I could take them with me, we could all be free together. It would be a final act of love, saving them from the suffering I can see so clearly in their futures." These entries, which documented Margaret's descent into what forensic psychiatrists would later identify as psychotic depression with delusional thinking, revealed a woman who had genuinely convinced herself that murdering her children was an act of love rather than an act of violence. This delusion, while clearly pathological, would become central to understanding both how Margaret had rationalized her actions and whether she met the legal standard for insanity. However, other evidence discovered during investigation suggested that alongside her delusional reasoning, Margaret had also been motivated by more conventional factors, including financial desperation and anger at her children for perceived abandonment. Financial records showed that Margaret and Robert had been struggling financially, with medical expenses from Robert's care depleting their savings and creating debt that Margaret apparently believed was unsustainable. Life insurance policies on both Linda and Daniel, with Margaret as the beneficiary, would have provided substantial funds that investigators argued had been a significant motivation for the murders alongside Margaret's psychological disturbance. The evening of October 14th, 2017, began with what appeared to be a typical family dinner at the Hendricks homestead, the kind of gathering that had occurred countless times over decades and that held no apparent warning of tragedy. Margaret had invited Linda and Daniel for Saturday dinner, a relatively common occurrence that neither child had any reason to view with suspicion. Linda had driven from Lancaster, arriving at her mother's home around 5 p.m. Daniel had come from his apartment in town, arriving shortly after his sister. Both were accustomed to these family dinners, and both viewed them as pleasant obligations that maintained family connection. According to the timeline reconstructed by investigators through witness statements, physical evidence, and Margaret's own eventual confession, the evening had proceeded normally initially. Margaret had prepared pot roast with vegetables, a family favorite that she had been making for decades. The three had eaten dinner together at the kitchen table, the same table where countless family meals had been shared over the years. Robert, bedridden since his stroke, had been in the master bedroom where Margaret typically fed him separately due to his physical limitations and the difficulty of moving him. The conversation during dinner had been ordinary, according to Margaret's later statements, discussion of Linda's work challenges, Daniel's business, updates on Sarah and Michael, and the mundane details of daily life that families share over meals. There had been no argument, no conflict, no dramatic moment that might have presaged violence. Everything had been normal, comfortable, familiar, right up until the moment Margaret served dessert. What occurred next would be reconstructed through forensic evidence, autopsy findings, crime scene analysis, and Margaret's own confession. Margaret had prepared apple pie for dessert, another family favorite that she knew both children loved. She had served slices to Linda and Daniel, pouring coffee to accompany the pie. She had not served herself pie, claiming she was too full from dinner, a detail that would gain significance later. Unknown to Linda and Daniel, Margaret had laced their pie with potassium, cyanide, a deadly poison that she had purchased online weeks earlier, using careful methods to avoid detection. The poison had been mixed into the pie filling, making it virtually undetectable by appearance or smell to individuals unsuspecting of danger in their mother's home. The effects of cyanide poisoning began within minutes of Linda and Daniel consuming the contaminated dessert. Both began experiencing symptoms that would initially have seemed like sudden illness, difficulty breathing, dizziness, rapid heartbeat. Linda, according to Margaret's confession, had asked if something was wrong with the pie, if maybe the apples had been bad. Daniel had stood up, apparently trying to get fresh air, before collapsing near the kitchen table. Cyanide poisoning is a horrific way to die. The poison works by preventing cells from using oxygen, essentially causing the victim to suffocate at a cellular level despite breathing. Symptoms include rapid breathing, seizures, loss of consciousness, and eventually cardiac arrest. For Linda and Daniel, the progression from first symptoms to death took approximately 10 to 15 minutes, an eternity of suffering and terror, as they realized something was catastrophically wrong, and as their mother stood watching rather than calling for help. Margaret's own confession, delivered with disturbing flatness of affect, described watching her children die while believing she was performing an act of mercy. They were suffering and confused. Linda kept asking me to call 911, but I knew there was no point, that the poison was working and that soon they would be free. I held Linda's hand as she lost consciousness. I told her I loved her and that this was the last time she would ever have to be afraid or in pain. Daniel was more agitated. He tried to reach his phone, but he collapsed before he could. I told him it would be over soon, that he could rest. This clinical description of allowing her children to die in agony while telling herself she was helping them revealed the profound disconnect between Margaret's perception and reality. She had convinced herself that murder was mercy, that watching her children die was an act of love, and that their terror and suffering were simply unfortunate necessities on the path to the release she believed she was giving them. After both Linda and Daniel had died, Margaret had engaged in behavior that suggested some return to reality, or at least recognition that her actions would have legal consequences. She had attempted to stage the scene to suggest the deaths were accidental, perhaps from food poisoning rather than deliberate poisoning. She had called 911 at 7:43 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after her children had stopped breathing, claiming that both had suddenly become ill during dinner and had collapsed. The 911 call, recorded and later played during trial, captured Margaret's performance of shock and distress. "My children, they're not breathing. We were having dinner, and they both got sick suddenly, and now they won't wake up. Please send help." Her voice conveyed panic, but investigators would later note that her breathing patterns and vocal quality suggested controlled performance rather than genuine hysteria, similar to other cases where killers had staged discovery of their victims. Emergency responders arrived at the Hendricks residence at 7:51 p.m., finding a scene that initially appeared to support Margaret's account of sudden illness. Both Linda and Daniel were on the kitchen floor, not breathing, showing no signs of life. Paramedics immediately began resuscitation attempts, while also noting concerning symptoms that didn't align with typical medical emergencies: the bright pink coloration of the victim's skin, a distinctive smell of almonds that some people can detect with cyanide, and the rapid progression from apparent health to death that Margaret described. Despite aggressive intervention, both Linda and Daniel were pronounced dead at the scene at 8:14 p.m. and 8:17 p.m. respectively, with paramedics unable to establish sustainable cardiac rhythm or respiratory function. The unusual nature of their symptoms, combined with the fact that two previously healthy adults had died simultaneously of apparent sudden illness, immediately raised suspicions among the responding paramedics who requested law enforcement presence. Millville Police Department officers arrived shortly after the paramedics, finding Margaret in a state of apparent shock, sitting at the kitchen table and repeating that she didn't understand what happened, and that they had just been having a normal dinner. This performance, while seemingly appropriate for someone who had just lost two children to mysterious sudden illness, would quickly unravel as investigators began examining the scene more carefully, and as Margaret's behavior revealed inconsistencies. The investigation that followed would combine traditional detective work with sophisticated forensic toxicology and would ultimately reveal a carefully planned double murder. Detective Robert Martinez of the Millville Police Department, the lead investigator assigned to the case, had immediately noticed several concerning details that suggested the deaths were not from natural causes or accidental food contamination. First, Margaret herself showed no symptoms of illness, despite claiming to have eaten the same dinner as her children. When asked about this by detectives, Margaret claimed she hadn't eaten any pie because she was too full, but officers noted that her dinner plate appeared to have been barely touched, suggesting she had avoided eating the meal she had prepared. This selective consumption raised immediate red flags. Second, the pattern of symptoms described by Margaret and observed by paramedics was not consistent with typical food poisoning, which would cause gastrointestinal distress before systemic symptoms, and which would typically take hours rather than minutes to manifest. The rapid onset and the specific symptoms observed suggested chemical poisoning rather than bacterial contamination. Third, and most significantly, the distinctive almond odor that some paramedics had detected suggested cyanide poisoning, a conclusion that would be confirmed by subsequent autopsy and toxicology testing. Cyanide poisoning in two adults simultaneously from the same meal strongly suggested deliberate poisoning rather than accidental contamination. Based on these initial observations, Detective Martinez made the decision to treat the scene as a potential homicide and to consider Margaret as a suspect despite the apparent impossibility that a mother would murder her adult children. He requested that Margaret accompany officers to the police station for a formal interview, a request she agreed to without requesting an attorney, perhaps believing her performance would be convincing or perhaps too psychologically disturbed to recognize the danger she was in. The crime scene investigation, conducted by a joint team from local police and the Pennsylvania State Police Forensic Unit, documented a kitchen that showed no signs of struggle or conflict, but that contained crucial evidence of deliberate poisoning. The remaining pie in the kitchen, as well as the plates from which Linda and Daniel had eaten, were collected for analysis. A search of Margaret's home revealed the most damning evidence. A small jar of potassium cyanide hidden in her bedroom closet, along with printouts from websites about lethal poisons, their effects, and detection methods. Additionally, investigators found Margaret's journal, which documented her planning and her delusional reasoning. The journal entries showed clear progression from suicidal ideation to homicidal planning, with Margaret's thinking becoming increasingly distorted as she convinced herself that killing her children was an act of love. One entry from early October, less than 2 weeks before the murders, read, "I've purchased what I need. It will be peaceful. A family dinner, and then we'll all be free. I'm the only one brave enough to do what needs to be done. They'll understand eventually when they wake up in a place without pain or fear." The autopsy and toxicology testing conducted by the Dauphin County Coroner's Office confirmed what investigators had suspected. Both Linda and Daniel had died from acute cyanide poisoning, with lethal levels of the poison found in their stomach contents, blood, and tissues. The forensic pathologist determined that death had occurred within 10 to 15 minutes of ingestion, that the symptoms would have been terrifying and painful, and that both victims would have been aware something catastrophic was happening to them before losing consciousness. Most significantly, testing of the remaining pie from Margaret's kitchen confirmed that it had been deliberately laced with cyanide, with the poison mixed into the filling in quantities sufficient to kill anyone who consumed a full serving. Margaret's own pie server and kitchen implements showed traces of cyanide, demonstrating that she had handled the poison while preparing the dessert. This forensic evidence eliminated any possibility that the poisoning was accidental or that someone other than Margaret was responsible. The interrogation of Margaret Hendricks, conducted the evening after the murders with Margaret initially declining attorney representation, provided the confession that would seal her fate. Detective Martinez, an experienced investigator who had nonetheless never dealt with a matricide case, approached the interview with a combination of professional skepticism and genuine attempt to understand how a mother could poison her children. Margaret's demeanor during the interrogation was notably flat and eerily calm. She showed minimal emotional response when discussing her children's deaths. No tears, no visible distress beyond a general air of resignation. When Martinez asked her directly if she had poisoned Linda and Daniel, Margaret's response was chilling in its casualness. "Yes, I put the poison in their pie. But you have to understand, I didn't do it to hurt them. I did it to help them, to save them from all the suffering that was coming." Martinez, maintaining professional composure despite his personal shock, asked Margaret to explain what she meant. What followed was a detailed confession that revealed both Margaret's planning and her profoundly distorted thinking. She described purchasing the cyanide online weeks earlier, learning about lethal doses and how to disguise the taste, and planning the family dinner specifically as the setting for the murders because it felt right to end things the way we had shared so much life together at the family table. When asked about the specific moment she decided to kill her children, Margaret's response revealed the depth of her delusion. "I'd been thinking about it for months, but I made the final decision about 2 weeks ago when Linda called to tell me about some problem at her school. She was so stressed, so tired. I could hear it in her voice. And I thought, she's going to spend the next 30 or 40 years dealing with these problems, getting older and more tired, watching her children struggle, eventually caring for me and Robert, and then she'll die anyway. What kind of mother lets her child go through all that when she could spare her?" This explanation, which treated decades of normal life experience as suffering requiring elimination, demonstrated Margaret's complete disconnect from reality and from the value of human life and experience. Martinez, pushing for more details, asked if Margaret had considered that Linda and Daniel might want to live, that they might not share her view that life was suffering requiring escape. Margaret's response was chillingly dismissive. "They didn't know what I was saving them from. If I had told them my plan, they would have tried to stop me because they can't see what I see. But they're better off now. They're done. No more stress, no more pain, no more disappointment. I gave them peace." When Martinez confronted Margaret with the fact that cyanide poisoning is an agonizing way to die, that her children had suffered terribly in their final minutes, Margaret seemed genuinely surprised and troubled. "The websites said it was quick. I thought they would just get dizzy and fall asleep. I didn't want them to suffer. That was the whole point, to end suffering, not create it." This statement suggested some limits to Margaret's delusion. She could recognize that causing pain was bad. She just couldn't recognize that murder itself was wrong, or that the life she was ending had value. The interrogation also revealed more prosaic motives alongside Margaret's delusional thinking. When Martinez asked about the life insurance policies on Linda and Daniel, Margaret admitted she had been aware of them and had even recently verified the coverage amounts and beneficiary information. She claimed the insurance wasn't her primary motivation, but acknowledged that she had thought about how the money would help with Robert's care after her children were gone. This acknowledgement of financial benefit complicated the defense's later attempts to portray Margaret as purely delusional. Prosecutors would argue that Margaret's actions were motivated by a combination of factors: genuine mental illness and distorted thinking, financial desperation and the lure of insurance money, and anger at her children for having lives of their own while she was trapped in caregiving. This multi-layered motivation would make the case against insanity defense more compelling. The decision to charge Margaret as a competent adult facing murder charges came after extensive consultation between prosecutors and forensic psychiatrists who evaluated her. While Margaret clearly suffered from mental illness and delusional thinking, the critical legal question was whether she understood that her actions were wrong and whether she could conform her behavior to legal requirements. The conclusion, based on multiple evaluations, was that despite her mental illness, Margaret retained sufficient understanding of wrongfulness and sufficient capacity to control her behavior to be held criminally responsible. On October 18, 2017, 4 days after the murders, Margaret Hendricks was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was held without bail, with prosecutors arguing that she posed a continuing danger given her demonstrated willingness to kill family members she believed needed saving. Margaret's arraignment was attended by Sarah and Michael, who sat in the courtroom gallery weeping as they confronted the reality that their grandmother, the woman who had baked them cookies and attended their school plays, had murdered their mother and uncle. The trial of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Margaret Hendricks began on January 8, 2018, in Lancaster County Court of Common Pleas before Judge Thomas Richardson. The case had attracted significant media attention throughout Pennsylvania and had garnered some national coverage given the unusual nature of a grandmother murdering her adult children and the questions it raised about mental illness, caregiving stress, and family dynamics. The courtroom was filled daily with a mixture of media, legal observers, mental health professionals interested in the case's psychiatric dimensions, and community members who had known the Hendricks family. Jury selection proved extraordinarily challenging, with potential jurors expressing difficulty with the idea of sending a 68-year-old grandmother to prison for life, while also expressing horror at the nature of her crime. Many potential jurors knew someone who had struggled with depression or caregiving burden, creating sympathy for Margaret's circumstances, while also recognizing that those struggles did not typically lead to murder. After 3 weeks of careful examination, a jury of 7 women and 5 men was seated, all of whom had affirmed their ability to consider both the facts of the murders and Margaret's mental state fairly. Lead prosecutor Daniel Chen opened the trial by acknowledging the case's complexity, while emphasizing that mental illness does not excuse murder. Ladies and gentlemen, you are going to hear about a woman who was struggling. Margaret Hendricks had been caring for her severely disabled husband for years. She was depressed. She was overwhelmed. These are real struggles that deserve compassion. But Margaret Hendricks made a choice. She chose to purchase poison. She chose to plan her children's murders. She chose to invite them to dinner specifically to kill them. She chose to watch them die in agony rather than call for help. And she chose to do all of this for multiple reasons, including insurance money that would benefit her financially. Mental illness may explain how she justified these choices to herself, but it does not excuse murder. Chen displayed photographs of Linda and Daniel on the courtroom screen, showing them alive, vital, and full of promise. Linda Hendricks Morrison was 42 years old. She was a dedicated educator who shaped young lives every day. She was a loving mother to her 2 children who are now motherless. Daniel Hendricks was 38 years old. He ran a successful business and devoted himself to helping his parents. Both had full lives ahead of them. Margaret Hendricks took those lives because she had convinced herself she knew better than they did what they wanted and needed. The evidence will show premeditated, deliberate murder. We will ask you to find Margaret Hendricks guilty of first-degree murder. Defense attorney Jennifer Walsh faced the enormous challenge of defending a client who had confessed and whose planning was extensively documented. Walsh's opening strategy focused entirely on mental illness and the insanity defense, arguing that Margaret's delusional thinking meant she could not legally be held responsible for her actions. Members of the jury, Margaret Hendricks is sick. She has been sick for a long time. The evidence will show you a woman who developed psychotic depression, who came to genuinely believe that life was suffering, and that killing her children was an act of love that would spare them from inevitable pain. This is not a rational belief. This is delusion. This is mental illness so severe that Margaret could not understand the wrongfulness of her actions in any meaningful way. Walsh described the expert psychiatric testimony the defense would present. Testimony showing Margaret's long history of depression, her deterioration after her husband's stroke, and the development of delusional thinking that transformed murder into perceived mercy. The prosecution will show you that Margaret planned these murders. They're right, she did. But planning does not equal sanity. People with severe mental illness can still plan actions, can still execute those plans while being completely delusional about the meaning and rightness of those actions. Margaret Hendricks genuinely believed she was helping her children. That belief was insane, but it was real to her, and that matters under the law. The prosecution's case unfolded over 4 weeks, with witnesses and evidence creating a comprehensive portrait of planning, execution, and financial motivation that suggested Margaret was not merely delusional, but was rationally pursuing goals that benefited her. The testimony began with Sarah and Michael, who provided heartbreaking testimony about their mother and uncle, and about their inability to comprehend their grandmother's actions. Sarah Hendricks, 23 years old and completing graduate school when her mother was murdered, described her relationship with Linda and the impact of her death. "My mom was my best friend," Sarah testified through constant tears. She was the person I called when something good happened, when something bad happened, when I just needed to talk. She was excited about my future, about my career, about the possibility of me having children someday that she would be a grandmother to. My grandmother took all of that away. She took my mom, she took my uncle, and she took my sense of safety in the world. I will never feel safe again knowing that someone who claimed to love me could be planning to kill the people I love most. Michael Hendricks, 21, and in his final year of college, testified about his Uncle Daniel's role in his life and about the horror of learning his grandmother had murdered family members. Uncle Dan was like a second father to me, Michael stated. He taught me how to work on cars, how to manage money, how to be a man who keeps his word and treats people right. He was the steady presence in my life when everything else felt chaotic. Finding out my grandmother killed him and killed my mom destroyed something fundamental in me. I don't understand how someone who baked us cookies and read us stories could murder the people we loved most. I don't think I'll ever understand it. The testimony about Margaret's purchase and research regarding cyanide provided powerful evidence of planning and premeditation. Digital forensics expert Kevin Palmer walked the jury through Margaret's internet search history from the months before the murders, showing queries about lethal poisons, their detection, and their effects. The searches showed a clear progression from general research about ending suffering to specific information about how to kill with cyanide and how to avoid detection. One search from September 2017 was particularly damning. How much cyanide to kill an adult, followed shortly by Can cyanide be detected in autopsy? And How to disguise cyanide taste in food. These searches demonstrated that Margaret was not just contemplating abstract ideas about mercy killing, but was actively planning how to murder her children and potentially avoid being caught. The testimony about Margaret's purchase of the cyanide revealed additional evidence of deliberate planning. An investigator traced the purchase to an online chemical supply company that Margaret had contacted, claiming to need the substance for metal cleaning purposes related to her late father's jewelry-making hobby. The company, which sold chemicals for legitimate purposes but which did not have stringent verification procedures, had shipped a quantity of potassium cyanide sufficient to kill dozens of people to Margaret's home address. She had paid using a prepaid debit card rather than her regular credit card, a choice that suggested consciousness of guilt and desire to avoid creating easily traced records. The forensic testimony provided clinical but devastating evidence about how Linda and Daniel had died. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the forensic pathologist who performed both autopsies, testified that cyanide poisoning causes what is essentially cellular suffocation, that symptoms include difficulty breathing, seizures, and loss of consciousness, and that death typically occurs within minutes, but can feel much longer to the victim who is experiencing terror and physical distress. Cyanide poisoning is not a peaceful death, Dr. Morrison testified. Despite what internet sources might claim, victims experience severe symptoms including air hunger, the sensation of suffocating despite breathing along with rapid heart rate, seizures, and psychological terror as they realize something catastrophic is happening to them. Both Linda and Daniel would have been conscious and aware for several minutes before losing consciousness. they would have known they were dying. This testimony directly contradicted Margaret's claim that she had given her children a peaceful death, demonstrating that even if her motivation had been delusional mercy, the method she chose inflicted significant suffering. The jury's reaction to this testimony was visible, with several jurors appearing disturbed by the description of the victim's final minutes. The testimony regarding the life insurance policies provided evidence of financial motive alongside psychological delusion. An insurance investigator testified that Margaret had been the beneficiary of policies on both Linda and Daniel, totaling $750,000. That she had recently verified the policies were current and in force, and that she would have received this money upon their deaths had she not been arrested and charged with their murders. While this amount was not enormous, it was significant for someone in Margaret's financial situation facing mounting medical debt from her husband's care. Prosecutors argued that even if Margaret had convinced herself that killing her children was merciful, the financial benefit provided additional motivation and demonstrated that her thinking was not purely delusional. Defense attorneys countered that Margaret's awareness of the insurance policies didn't prove they were her primary motivation, that many people know about family life insurance without contemplating murder, and that Margaret's journal entries focused almost entirely on ending suffering rather than on financial gain. The prosecution's presentation of Margaret's journal entries provided the most comprehensive look into her mental state before the murders. Prosecutors selected entries that demonstrated planning, awareness of wrongfulness, and attempts to rationalize her intended actions. However, the entries also revealed genuine psychological disturbance and delusional thinking that would support the defense's insanity argument. An entry from late September 2017 showed Margaret's awareness that others would judge her actions harshly. People won't understand what I'm doing. They'll call me a monster. But that's because they can't see what I see. They don't understand that all of life is suffering, that the brief, happy moments don't compensate for the grinding reality of existence. Linda and Daniel don't see it yet because they're still in the middle of their lives, still distracted by work and daily concerns. But I can see their futures clearly, and those futures contain so much pain. Better to end it now while they're relatively happy rather than let them go through what's coming. This entry, while demonstrating delusional thinking, also showed Margaret was aware her actions would be condemned by others, which prosecutors argued proved she understood the wrongfulness of murder, even if she had convinced herself it was justified. Defense attorneys countered that understanding that others will judge an action as wrong is different from actually believing it is wrong, and that Margaret's delusion had so distorted her thinking that she genuinely believed she was acting virtuously despite knowing others would disagree. The defense's case, presented over 3 weeks, focused almost entirely on Margaret's mental illness and on expert testimony supporting the insanity defense. The defense called multiple psychiatrists who had evaluated Margaret, and who testified that she suffered from severe mental illness that had impaired her judgment and her understanding of reality. Dr. Richard Foster, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Margaret extensively, testified that she met the criteria for major depressive disorder with psychotic features. a condition characterized by severe depression combined with delusional thinking that can lead sufferers to lose touch with reality. Margaret Hendricks developed a delusional belief system in which death was preferable to life, and in which killing her children was transformed from murder into an act of love and mercy, Dr. Foster explained. This was not a choice to do evil. This was a severely mentally ill woman acting on beliefs that, while objectively insane, felt absolutely real and true to her. Dr. Foster walked the jury through the development of Margaret's illness, from her initial depression in midlife through her worsening symptoms after her husband's stroke to the emergence of psychotic features including delusional thinking about suffering and death. He described how caregiving stress, social isolation, and inadequate treatment had created a perfect storm for psychological deterioration, and how Margaret's cultural background and generational attitudes about mental health had prevented her from seeking the intensive psychiatric care she needed. On cross-examination, Prosecutor Chen challenged Dr. Foster's testimony by highlighting aspects of Margaret's behavior that suggested rational thinking and awareness of wrongfulness. Dr. Foster, if Margaret truly believed she was performing an act of love, why did she use a prepaid debit card to purchase the poison rather than her regular credit card? Chen asked. Doesn't that suggest consciousness of guilt and desire to avoid detection? Dr. Foster struggled to provide a fully satisfying answer, acknowledging that some of Margaret's behaviors suggested awareness of legal consequences while maintaining that this didn't negate her fundamental delusion about the rightness of her actions. This exchange highlighted the central challenge for the defense. Margaret's planning and attempts at concealment suggested rational thinking that was inconsistent with complete loss of capacity to understand wrongfulness. The defense also called witnesses who testified about Margaret's life circumstances and the stress she had been under. Friends described the burden of caring for Robert, the social isolation Margaret had experienced, and signs of her deteriorating mental health that they had noticed but hadn't understood as warning signs of dangerous decompensation. A home health nurse who had visited the Hendricks home described the physically and emotionally exhausting nature of caring for someone with Robert's level of disability, providing context for understanding Margaret's mental state. However, these witnesses' testimony, while generating sympathy for Margaret's circumstances, did little to change the fundamental legal question. Did her mental illness rise to the level of insanity that would excuse her from criminal responsibility? The prosecution effectively argued that many people face similar or worse stresses without murdering their children. That mental illness is common, but murder is rare, and that understanding someone's suffering doesn't require excusing their crimes. The decision about whether to have Margaret testify generated intense debate within the defense team. Ultimately, recognizing that Margaret's flat effect and her continued belief that she had done nothing wrong would likely damage rather than help her case, Walsh decided against calling her to testify during the guilt phase. This decision meant jurors would not hear directly from Margaret except through her recorded confession and her journal entries, perhaps the best outcome given her demonstrated inability to express appropriate remorse or to present her actions in a way that would generate sympathy. The closing arguments began on February 12, 2018. Prosecutor Chen delivered a powerful synthesis of the evidence and an appeal for accountability despite mental illness. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard extensive testimony about Margaret Hendricks' depression, her stress, her caregiving burden. All of that is real. All of that deserves compassion. But Margaret Hendricks planned to murder her children for months. She researched how to do it. She purchased poison. She invited them to dinner specifically to kill them. She watched them die in agony rather than calling for help. And she stood to benefit financially from insurance policies. This is not insanity. This is murder. Chen addressed the insanity defense directly, arguing that the legal standard required more than just mental illness or even delusional thinking. Mental illness does not equal legal insanity. Many people suffer from depression, from delusions, from distorted thinking. They do not kill their children. Legal insanity requires that the defendant did not understand that what they were doing was wrong. But Margaret understood perfectly well. She used a prepaid card to hide her poison purchase. She researched how to avoid detection. She lied to police when they first arrived. All of this demonstrates understanding that her actions were wrong, that she would be judged for them, that she could face consequences. She knew it was wrong. She did it anyway. That is not insanity. That is murder. Defense attorney Walsh made a final, passionate appeal for the jury to recognize Margaret's mental illness and to find her not guilty by reason of insanity. Margaret Hendricks is profoundly mentally ill. The experts have told you this. Her actions grew out of delusional thinking so severe that she transformed murder into mercy in her mind. Yes, she planned. Yes, she tried to avoid detection. But people with severe mental illness can still plan, can still take steps to avoid consequences while being completely delusional about the fundamental rightness of their actions. Margaret genuinely believed she was saving her children from suffering. That belief was insane, and that matters. The jury began deliberations on February 13, 2018, at 10 a.m. They deliberated for approximately 18 hours over 2 days, suggesting genuine wrestling with the complex questions of mental illness versus criminal responsibility. They returned to the courtroom on February 14th at 4:15 p.m. with their verdict. Judge Richardson asked the jury foreman if they had reached verdicts. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. The verdict forms were passed to the judge and then to the clerk for reading. In the matter of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Margaret Hendricks, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Linda Hendricks Morrison, we the jury find the defendant guilty as charged. The courtroom remained silent except for quiet sobbing from Sarah and Michael. Margaret showed minimal visible reaction, her expression remaining blank as the verdict was read. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Daniel Hendricks, we the jury find the defendant guilty as charged. The jury's rejection of the insanity defense meant Margaret would face mandatory sentences of life imprisonment without possibility of parole for each murder conviction. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for March 15, 2018, providing time for victim impact statements and final arguments about whether the sentences should run concurrently or consecutively. The month between conviction and sentencing was marked by Margaret's continued psychological deterioration. Jail staff reported that she had become increasingly withdrawn. spending most of her time sitting silently in her cell and showing minimal engagement with anyone or anything around her. When mental health professionals attempted to evaluate her, she provided limited responses and showed continued flat affect that suggested either profound depression or psychological shutdown in the face of her situation. The sentencing hearing on March 15, 2018, began with victim impact statements that provided the most emotionally powerful moments of the entire case. Sarah Hendricks approached the podium with a prepared statement, but her composure broke as she began speaking, and what followed was raw, unfiltered grief and rage. "You murdered my mother," Sarah began, her voice shaking with emotion as she looked directly at Margaret. "You murdered my uncle. You destroyed our family, and you did it while pretending it was for our benefit, while telling yourself you were being merciful. There was nothing merciful about what you did. My mother died, terrified and in pain. My uncle died the same way. They died knowing their own mother was killing them. I will carry that horror for the rest of my life." Sarah's voice grew stronger as anger overtook grief. "You say you were saving them from suffering, but you're the one who caused suffering. You took away all the good things they would have experienced. Mom would never see me get married, would never meet her grandchildren, would never retire and travel like she'd been planning. Uncle Dan would never find his own happiness, would never build the life he deserved. You stole all of that because you decided you knew better than they did what they wanted. You're not merciful. You're selfish and cruel, and I hope you spend every day of the rest of your life thinking about what you took from them and from us." As Sarah returned to her seat, Margaret's expression remained impassive, showing no visible response to her granddaughter's anguish and rage. This absence of reaction did not go unnoticed by Judge Richardson, who would later reference it in his sentencing remarks. Michael Hendricks followed his sister to the podium, his statement shorter but no less powerful in its expression of loss and anger. "My grandmother killed my mother and my uncle. She sat across from me at Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings, knowing she was planning to murder them. She hugged me and told me she loved me while carrying this plan in her mind. That makes me feel like I never knew her at all, like the grandmother I thought I had was just a mask covering a monster. I don't know which is worse, losing my mom and uncle, or realizing the grandmother I loved never really existed." Other family members and friends provided statements describing Linda and Daniel's impact on their lives and the permanent void their deaths had created. Linda's ex-husband, Thomas Morrison, testified about her dedication as a mother and about the impact on their children of losing her. Daniel's business partner testified about his character and about the ripple effects of his death through the community. Throughout these statements, Margaret remained seated at the defense table, showing minimal emotional response. Her apparent inability to engage with the pain her actions had caused created an impression of someone fundamentally disconnected from reality or from normal human emotion. Defense attorney Walsh made a final plea for concurrent sentences that would at least leave some theoretical possibility of Margaret dying outside prison walls. "Your Honor, Margaret Hendricks is 68 years old. She will die in prison whether her sentences run concurrently or consecutively. Consecutive sentences would mean she would need to live to 136 years old to complete them. We ask that the court impose concurrent sentences, recognizing that Margaret's crimes grew out of severe mental illness rather than evil intent. Prosecutor Chen countered by arguing that consecutive sentences were appropriate, given the deliberate murder of two separate victims. Your Honor, Margaret Hendricks murdered two people. Linda and Daniel were separate individuals whose lives had separate value. Their murders were separate acts requiring separate punishment. Concurrent sentences would suggest that the second murder mattered less than the first. Justice for both victims requires consecutive sentences. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Richardson offered Margaret an opportunity to address the court. Margaret rose slowly from her seat, and what followed was a statement that seemed to confirm she remained out of touch with reality and with the moral dimensions of her actions. I want to say that I'm sorry for the pain I've caused, Margaret began, her voice flat and her words sounding rehearsed. I never intended for anyone to suffer. I thought I was helping Linda and Daniel by sparing them from the suffering I knew was coming for them. I see now that I was wrong about that. They wanted to live. They didn't want to be saved. I should have respected their choice to keep living even though I could see all the pain that was waiting for them. This statement, which acknowledged that her children wanted to live while still framing their continued existence as merely choosing to face pain, demonstrated Margaret's continued inability to understand that life itself has value beyond the avoidance of suffering. Her words suggested she still believed her perception about life being primarily suffering was correct, and that her only error was in not respecting others' right to choose continued suffering. Margaret then made a statement that would trigger the violent response that shocked the courtroom. Still standing at the podium, she looked toward where Sarah and Michael sat in the gallery and said, I hope you understand someday that I loved you. I loved your mother and your uncle. Everything I did came from love. You may not believe that now, but it's the truth. The idea that Margaret was characterizing murder as an act of love, that she was asking Linda's children to understand and presumably forgive the murder of their mother, proved too much for Sarah and Michael to bear. What followed happened so quickly that bailiffs were unable to prevent it until it was already underway. Sarah, sitting in the front row of the gallery, exploded from her seat screaming, You murdered my mother! You murdered my uncle! You're a monster! She lunged toward the defense table where Margaret sat, having to be physically restrained by bailiffs who positioned themselves between Sarah and her grandmother. Michael, sitting beside his sister, stood as well, and attempted to reach his grandmother before being grabbed by additional bailiffs. The courtroom erupted into chaos as family, members, and spectators reacted to the attack, with some trying to help restrain Sarah and Michael, while others simply watched in shock. Margaret, for the first time in the entire trial, showed visible fear, shrinking back in her chair as her grandchildren screamed at her. Judge Richardson ordered immediate clearing of the courtroom except for essential personnel, and Sarah and Michael were forcibly removed while still screaming accusations and threats at their grandmother. After order was restored, and a brief recess to allow everyone to compose themselves, Judge Richardson addressed what had occurred. What we have just witnessed is the raw manifestation of grief and rage caused by Margaret Hendricks' actions. While I cannot condone violence in this courtroom, I understand the emotional devastation that prompted it. Sarah and Michael Hendricks have lost their mother and uncle to murder by their own grandmother. The pain of that loss, combined with hearing Margaret characterize murder as love, proved too much to bear. The judge then proceeded with sentencing, his remarks reflecting both the legal requirements and the emotional reality of the case. Margaret Hendricks, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence showed that you planned these murders for months, that you purchased poison specifically to kill your children, and that you invited them to dinner for the purpose of ending their lives. While you suffered from mental illness, that illness did not rise to the level of legal insanity that would excuse your crimes. Judge Richardson continued, his tone becoming more severe as he prepared to impose sentence. Pennsylvania law requires that I sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole for each murder conviction. The question before me is whether these sentences should run concurrently or consecutively. I find that consecutive sentences are appropriate. You murdered 2 separate people. Linda and Daniel were individuals whose lives had separate value. Their murders were separate crimes requiring separate punishment. The judge then pronounced the formal sentence. Margaret Hendricks, for the first-degree murder of Linda Hendricks Morrison. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. For the first-degree murder of Daniel Hendricks, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to run consecutively with the first sentence. You will spend the remainder of your life in prison with no possibility of release. Judge Richardson concluded with words that captured the tragedy's full dimensions. You took the lives of 2 people who loved you and trusted you. You transformed a family dinner, a symbol of connection and love, into an execution. You have destroyed your family completely. Linda and Daniel are dead. Sarah and Michael have lost their mother and uncle, and the grandmother they thought they knew. Robert has lost his children and must live knowing his wife killed them. And you will die in prison, having achieved none of the peace or freedom you claimed to seek. This is a tragedy without redemption, without winners, without any outcome that could be called just or satisfying. But the law requires accountability, and that is what this sentence provides. As Margaret was led from the courtroom to begin serving her consecutive life sentences, she appeared smaller and frailer than she had throughout the trial, perhaps finally processing some reality of her situation. The courtroom remained largely silent, the weight of the double life sentences and the earlier violent outburst leaving everyone emotionally exhausted. The aftermath of Margaret Hendricks' conviction and sentencing rippled through multiple communities and raised profound questions about mental illness, caregiving stress, and family violence. Sarah and Michael faced criminal charges for their courtroom attack on their grandmother, though these were ultimately reduced to disorderly conduct with sentences of community service and mandatory counseling, with prosecutors and the judge recognizing that their actions, while illegal, were understandable given their trauma. Margaret began serving her consecutive life sentences at State Correctional Institution at Muncie, Pennsylvania's primary facility for female inmates. Prison records from her first years described her as an isolated inmate who participated minimally in programming, showed limited engagement with other prisoners or staff, and spent most of her time in her cell. Mental health evaluations continued to document severe depression, though whether this represented progression of her original illness or response to imprisonment remained unclear. The question of whether Margaret would have been better served by psychiatric hospitalization rather than imprisonment remained subject to intense debate. Mental health advocates pointed to her case as an example of how the criminal justice system fails to adequately address severe mental illness, arguing that Margaret needed treatment more than punishment. However, prosecutors and victim advocates noted that Margaret had been found legally sane under the applicable standard, and that her crimes, regardless of her mental state, required accountability through the criminal justice system. Robert Hendricks, Margaret's husband and the father of the murdered victims, faced an impossible situation. His wife had murdered his children, leaving him alone with severe disability requiring care he could no longer receive from family. He was eventually placed in a nursing home, where staff reported he rarely spoke and showed signs of profound depression. He declined all communication with Margaret, telling a social worker, "She's not my wife anymore. My wife died when she killed our children." The Hendricks family home, where generations had gathered for family dinners, was eventually sold by the estate. The new owners, aware of its history, struggled to make it feel like a home rather than a crime scene. The kitchen table where Linda and Daniel had been poisoned was removed and destroyed, though the physical space remained as a permanent reminder of the tragedy. The case raised important questions about warning signs and prevention of family violence. Margaret's deteriorating mental health had been observable to friends, family, and medical providers. Yet the warning signs had not been recognized as indicating homicidal risk. This failure prompted discussions about better screening for caregivers' mental health, better education about the warning signs of serious decompensation, and the importance of taking seriously any expression of desire to end one's own life or others' lives to spare them suffering. The insurance companies holding policies on Linda and Daniel denied benefits to Margaret, based on the Slayer rule that prevents murderers from profiting from their crimes. The death benefits were eventually paid to Sarah and Michael as alternate beneficiaries, providing them with financial resources, but also creating complicated feelings about receiving money connected to their mother's and uncle's murders. Linda's elementary school and Daniel's business both created memorial initiatives to honor their lives and continue their legacies. Riverside Elementary established the Linda Hendricks Morrison Compassionate Leadership Award, given annually to an educator who demonstrated Linda's combination of academic excellence and genuine care for students' emotional well-being. Daniel's business partner continued the shop under its original name, dedicating its work to Daniel's memory and his commitment to honest, fair dealing. Sarah and Michael, both in their 20s when they lost their mother and uncle, required intensive therapy to process their trauma and their complicated feelings toward their grandmother. Both described struggling with the cognitive dissonance between their memories of Margaret as a loving grandmother and the reality of her as their mother's killer. Sarah told a therapist, "I remember her teaching me to bake cookies. I remember her reading me stories. How do I reconcile those memories with the fact that she murdered my mom?" both things are true, but they can't exist together in my mind. The legal precedent established by the case proved relatively limited, given that Margaret had been found legally sane and thus did not create new insanity defense standards. However, the case was frequently cited in discussions about the limits of the insanity defense, about how to evaluate defendants whose actions grew from delusional thinking, but who also demonstrated awareness of legal wrongfulness, and about the challenge of responding appropriately to family violence rooted in mental illness. As of 2024, Margaret Hendricks remained incarcerated at SCI Muncie, having served 6 years of consecutive life sentences that would require her to live to 136 years old to complete. She was 74 years old, in declining health, and facing the certainty of dying in prison for the murders she committed at 68. Prison records indicated minimal change in her affect or her understanding of her crimes, with counselors noting she continued to express belief that her actions had been motivated by love even while acknowledging they were wrong. The tragedy of October 14, 2017, stood as a stark reminder of how mental illness, inadequately addressed and allowed to progress to delusional severity, could transform family bonds into deadly violence. Linda and Daniel had trusted their mother, had gathered at her table believing they were sharing a family meal, and had died terrified and confused by the woman who should have protected them. Margaret had convinced herself that murder was mercy, that she was saving her children from inevitable suffering, and had acted on that delusion with devastating consequences for everyone involved. The courtroom attack by Sarah and Michael, while shocking and unprecedented in Judge Richardson's courtroom, served as a powerful reminder that the justice system's attempt to provide closure through legal proceedings can never truly heal wounds as deep as those created by family murder. Legal accountability, while necessary, could not restore what was lost, could not help Sarah and Michael understand their grandmother's actions, and could not provide the sense of resolution that justice sometimes promises but rarely delivers. The case remained a touchstone in discussions about caregiving stress, about the importance of addressing mental health issues before they progress to dangerous levels, and about the complex intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. It raised uncomfortable questions about how society responds when grandmothers become killers, when family dinners become murder scenes, and when love, however distorted, transforms into the justification for taking life rather than protecting it. The courtroom where Margaret was sentenced continued to handle criminal cases, though Judge Richardson later told a colleague that the Hendricks case was the most emotionally difficult he had presided over in 30 years on the bench. The image of Sarah and Michael, consumed by grief and rage, attacking their grandmother while screaming accusations haunted everyone who witnessed it, serving as a visceral reminder that some tragedies create pain that cannot be contained within the orderly procedures of courtrooms and legal systems. Margaret's characterization of murder as love, her inability to grasp that the value of human life extends beyond the avoidance of suffering, became emblematic of how mental illness can distort perception so fundamentally that even the most basic moral truths become unrecognizable. Her statement that she hoped her grandchildren would someday understand that she had acted from love revealed a disconnect from reality so profound that no amount of legal proceedings or psychological treatment seemed capable of bridging it. As Margaret aged in prison, facing the certainty of dying there, the question of whether she would ever develop genuine understanding of what she had done remained open. Some prison counselors believed that with continued treatment and the passage of time, she might eventually achieve insight into the horror of her actions. Others believed her delusional thinking was too deeply rooted, that she would die still believing she had been merciful rather than monstrous, still unable to grasp that her children's lives had value beyond her perception of their suffering. Sarah and Michael, carrying the burden of losing their mother and uncle, while also grappling with their complicated feelings toward their grandmother, faced a lifetime of processing trauma that had destroyed their family. Their attack on Margaret in the courtroom, while legally inappropriate, was understandable as the eruption of grief and rage that had been building throughout a trial, where they had to maintain composure while hearing their grandmother's actions clinically dissected, and her supposed love for her victims repeatedly invoked. The Hendricks case ultimately served as a grim testament to the inadequacy of any legal or societal response to certain categories of family violence. Margaret would die in prison, Linda and Daniel would remain dead, and Sarah and Michael would spend their lives processing a trauma that defied comprehension. The criminal justice system had provided accountability through conviction and sentencing, but it could not provide healing, could not restore what was lost, and could not answer the fundamental questions about how someone who professed love could commit murder and call it mercy. The family dinner table, historically a symbol of connection and shared life, had been transformed by Margaret's actions into a site of betrayal and death, destroying not just the individuals who died there, but the very possibility of trust and safety within family bonds for those who survived. That transformation, perhaps more than any legal outcome, represented the truest measure of the tragedy's scope and the permanent damage caused by a grandmother who convinced herself that murder was an act of love worth imposing on those she claimed to cherish.